Hi folks, welcome to, at long last, another episode of The Hole on the Corner, where we're talking R.A. Lafferty. I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Rockter. I didn't mean for the hiatus to be that long. I had to stop and do a little bit of teaching. I have an incredibly super part-time teaching job, but keeps me just occupied enough to kind of make it a little harder to make videos at the time. There's my dog growling. And I've run into just endless personal and circumstantial roadblocks, including technological stuff, to where I've had this video on the short story Snuffles recorded quite a few times at this point, and hours worth of video and notes and PowerPoint and all sorts of things lost irretrievably. And was finally getting back to it today, and the audio won't work on my computer to record the PowerPoint, etc. And I tried, I Googled all the fixes and what have you, but I don't have the means at this time to upgrade my technology. So we're back to just planting the phone there, and it's a bloke chatting, holding up a book every now and again. And that's what we got. I was trying to add a little more visual component to it, but we'll have to see if that can happen in the future. Regardless, here we are. We're going to talk about Lafferty's short story from 1960 called Snuffles, which is just an awesome short story title to begin with. And here's why. As I said, I've been working on this for a while actually, and I first started to try to do this when, okay, so I'm doing this in response to a podcast called Alzebo Soup, which is a Gene Wolfe podcast, and those of you who are Gene Wolfe fans will recognize what that title of the podcast is about. And they recently finished up a very long, multi-volume work by Wolfe, and we're taking a break, and they're doing some readings of some cosmic horror short fiction. And they had this really interesting approach they were doing where they weren't doing any Lovecraft, and they started with a Robert Chambers story and stuff. And they had announced early on that they were going to do some episodes on Snuffles as part of their cosmic horror series, and I was like, amazing, this is exciting. If anybody's covering Lafferty at all, that they're covering a story like Snuffles, which is criminally neglected. It's not, in the sense that it's not been included in the recent best of Lafferty, and these kinds of things. So I was really excited, and that they're covering it as cosmic horror, which super intrigues me. If you've seen any of my previous videos, I'm a big advocate of, in part, seeing Lafferty placed within weird fiction and horror. Just, what is his relationship to that? I'm not saying he doesn't really fit very neatly into just any genre at all, but he's mostly thought of in terms of science fiction, and I think he can be thought of in terms of a lot of other types of fiction, including weird fiction. And I don't know that I had thought of Snuffles as a cosmic horror story, but as soon as they say it, I'm like, oh yeah, it kind of is, isn't it? I mean, I certainly thought of it as one of Lafferty's more horror type pieces, and it's certainly sci-fi horror set on another planet. And I do think it is, in its way, well, that's what we're going to question, is it cosmic horror? So these guys have done, back when they first announced that, I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to make a video on Snuffles and then respond to what they say. Well, it took them 2 episodes to get through it, so I don't feel so bad about how long this is going to be for me to get through it, because it's probably going to be a couple videos just to get through my take. But I want to do my take first, and I'm dying to listen to their episodes, and I haven't been able to because of, in production with this one. So once I get this done, that's going to be the first thing I do, is go take a long walk with my dog and listen to those episodes, and I'm very excited about that. And then I'll come back and do a 3rd video responding to them. So the story, as I said, was published in 1960. It was first published in Galaxy magazine in the December 1960 edition, or not episode, issue. And it was collected in 900 Grandmothers, which is part of, I think it's a key story from Lafferty, and one of his best for me. So it is part of what makes a story collection like 900 Grandmothers seminal and important. And it really should have been in this best of. When I was thinking about my frustrations with this best of, one of the things that occurred to me is like, okay, here's what Snuffles could have added to this collection that is much, much needed. I think there's a number of missing key elements of that are crucial to Lafferty, and just bring out some of his most important and most exciting aspects, right, that are largely missing from the stories chosen for this collection, right? But Snuffles, for example, would have brought some much needed teeth to this collection, all right? Lafferty typically has some stories with teeth in any given collection. Now, this has a little bit of that kind of thing, particularly toward the end with the inclusion of stories like Thieving Bear Planet and Days of Grass, Days of Straw, with a little bit of violence and gore, but of a kind of different kind than what you get in Snuffles, and the particularly weird and comical sort of horror that makes it more unsettling that you get in Snuffles. So I just, that's one stab at like why I find this collection a little anemic. And another story they left out from 900 Grandmothers that I think would have been crucial is The Hole on the Corner, after which this podcast is named, which also has a certain level of teeth, though not as much as Snuffles. Okay, so published in 1960. It was also included, I think this is very fascinating, it was included in a Best SF Volume 7, edited by Edmund Crispin. And in 1970, this 1960 story was collected as Best SF7 alongside the likes of Vonnegut, Aldous, Zelazny, Brunner, Dish, and others. So luminaries of the new wave of science fiction. And when they grabbed a story from Lafferty, they went back to this 1960 story. So I think that potentially is significant. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about how this story exemplifies what's coming. It's not even arrived yet in new wave science fiction. Okay. Even though Lafferty's association with the new wave is somewhat incidental, but there's reasons why, they really liked Lafferty. Okay, so it's also been collected in the Centipede series that's collecting all of Lafferty's fiction in very expensive limited edition volumes. So it was in volume 3 of that, The Man Underneath. Yeah, so it was collected in that. And it's actually been collected in quite a few non-English anthologies of science fiction and a few, like Lafferty anthologies. So, yeah. Now, here's what I want to say as to sort of introing it and sort of outlining it. All right, so a couple things. One is that I am I want to start to go through Lafferty's fiction beat by beat. Okay, I want to take my time with it. And I really like to listen to, for example, these Gene Wolfe podcasts. There's 3 main ones that just really take their time spending 1 to like 3 or 4 more, episodes on any given short story by Gene Wolfe or novella or chapters, of a book and that kind of thing. And, Wolfe's work kind of demands or certainly repays that kind of careful, close reading, okay? And I'm not sure it's always understood or appreciated that this is actually true of Lafferty by and large as well. There's a level of complexity and layering that is belied by the strangeness, the funniness, the weirdness, the seeming, chaos of it, that you could miss that there's just layers and layers of symbols and allusions and complexities of philosophy and theory and so on going on in his fiction. And Snuffles is a really good example of that. It's a pretty perplexing story. There's kind of an ambiguity or maybe ambiguities kind of at the heart of it that I am still struggling with. I just do not know what to make of it. And to see Lafferty's genius and kind of the power of what he does, I think we need to get into the details. And this will, I think, be borne out even more when my plan is to next go through Past Master, which I have I have a big old PowerPoint for that as well, which I'm probably not going to be able to use except as notes. We'll start going through that like chapter by chapter, although I'll probably try to go a little faster and do a couple chapters per video or something, but regardless. So I want to do that kind of work with Lafferty. Also, I want to say that in regard to the fact that I wanted to do, to show some visuals and do PowerPoints, I am at this, while I'm trying to include a little more visual element in that way, which I'm not able to do at this time, I am also trying to make this as friendly as possible to just audio listening, in case people just want to turn this on in their car on a commute, or like I do walking my dog or something, and just turn on YouTube and listen. So I'm hoping it kind of works in that way, and I just give me some time to kind of get a little smoother and provide that kind of content. I hope I can, and let me know if that's working for you or not, if you are that kind of viewer listener for this stuff. But yeah, and not only does it all, does the slow kind of approach to Lafferty bring out these qualities in him, kind of help us look at them. It's as I've said before, I'm making the content I wish already existed that I could just consume. I want to hear people talk about Lafferty at length like this, so I was so pleased that somebody's doing a short story on a podcast, and then that they ended up taking 2 episodes to do it, around an hour long each. That's very exciting. So I'm really looking forward to see what they do with that. Now, lastly, as to just general thoughts about Snuffles. I mean, I have a few more general, but they get into like at least the outline of the story. As I was reading through this, it also struck me that, as I was rereading, I've read this story many times, this story provides kind of a class in reading R.A. Lafferty. At least in terms of acclimating you to what it's like, the experience of reading R.A. Lafferty, which is interesting because it does so to you as a reader, but you also, what the characters experience is also what it's like to read Lafferty, and I'll try to point out a few things about that. And this, I think, is important because, okay, so speaking of Gene Wolfe, right, I've noticed, I don't know why exactly this is happening, but in the past year or so, I've heard several Gene Wolfe fans through various forums mention that they've begun reading Lafferty, and particularly, there's always been some overlap there between that readership, but there's been new readers. And particularly people are checking out his debut novel, Past Master, probably because it's now available in the Library of America edition and so on. And it's had some good coverage on YouTube with Matt's Book Pilled channel. And I think that's also a reason why. But so people are reading that novel, and these Gene Wolfe fans, almost the unanimous response is, okay, we thought Wolfe was pretty difficult, but Lafferty is like, I don't know that people are finding him next level difficult to Wolfe, maybe a similar level of difficulty, but just a very different kind of complexity, or, well, I think people are wondering, is this complexity or is it just chaos? And I think it's kind of understandable response. But I would say that whilst there is definitely an element of a sort of constant veering into sort of side streets, so to speak, in the narrative, there is a lot, as you read and reread and do close readings, there's so much more cohesion than you can imagine at first. And I've been noticing this in my rereads through Past Master, especially. There's a handful of things I'm like, I had no idea these parts of the novel connected before so clearly, So it's quite exciting, actually, in reading Lafferty. So if Snuffles is able to help acclimate us to that in a smaller, in a shorter story, then that could be useful. I think people are gonna bounce off Lafferty and be like, I'm not, that was too much, or just not of interest to me. But for those who are intrigued and maybe drawn in a little bit, but perplexed, maybe going slowly through Snuffles can help a little bit to acclimate to that. And it's not like a key, a decoder, a ring that you can join the club and this is how to read Lafferty. But I do, it's been hitting me that it hits some notes that are kind of like, okay, this is what's happening in Lafferty to a certain degree. Okay, so Snuffles. Snuffles is what I call a Chestertonian planetfall story. Okay, now if you're not familiar with G.K. Chesterton, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, he was an Edwardian author in England, and he has some ideological preoccupations for which your mileage may vary, as they say. Certainly does for me, and there's definitely a few things that are just atrocious in Chesterton, and then just some things that people will differ about, sort of philosophically and ideologically and politically and these sorts of things. But but yeah, so this is not just a blanket endorsement of Chesterton. I do think there's some real problems there. But he is an exciting person to read. Not much read these days, but he was a contemporary of like H.G. Wells, and he had these like public debates with H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw and stuff. So he's quite a man of letters from that time. One of his more famous books apparently is his biography of Charles Dickens, which I've never read. But yeah, so he wrote, he considered himself a journalist first and foremost. And he wrote a bunch of short stories, essays, and quite a few novels as well. And to say that something is Chestertonian, right, is to say that it has, well, mainly what I was thinking when I thought of that was that it has Chesterton's sense of wonder. Okay, he has this sense of wonder that he brings to the mundane world, and often sort of at the sentence level. Where he just kind of takes the everyday objects and things going on around us and like explodes them with sort of strangeness. It's just a fresh perspective on them. Like, whoa, our world is pretty weird when you just stop taking it for granted for a second and think about it fresh. And it's very lovely. It's very exciting to read. And people like Neil Gaiman are big admirers of Chesterton for that reason. And, Gaiman includes a Chestertonian figure in his, Sandman series and stuff like that. But, he often brings up Chesterton as like, and even like a fresh inspiration when he needs fresh inspiration. He says he'll read some Chesterton. So, he has his admirers in contemporary, writing and so on, even if he's not, that well known of a character these days. But he was also a favorite of Lafferty. Lafferty, I think, said that Chesterton was his favorite author. And before I ever knew that Lafferty said that, and before you can see Lafferty quote Chesterton here and there, I had been reading Chesterton before reading Lafferty, and I was immediately struck. I was like, man, this guy is so Chestertonian. He's so, but like in this totally different American type setting, and in the, in mid to late 20th century rather than early, 1900s or whatever when Chesterton's work was coming out. So it speaks to that sense of wonder. And Lafferty has that, of course, in spades. However, there's this other element that makes perfect sense, especially with Snuffles, and makes it even more appropriate to call Snuffles a Chestertonian planetfall story. And so I was reminded that Ramsey Campbell mentioned Chesterton in his introduction to Lafferty's short story, The Funny Face Murders, that Campbell included in his New Terrors series, volume 2 of that, alongside people like Stephen King and Robert Bloch, and is that right? Yeah, and stuff like that. He's got a Lafferty story in here. And as I've mentioned before, Lafferty's been collected in a lot of horror anthologies, strangely enough. And what Ramsey Campbell says in here is that this story that he included, The Funny Face Murders, which I'm just not going to get into it all. Okay. But he says, it reminds me very slightly of one of Chesterton's nightmares, say The Man Who Was Thursday, without the theological reassurance. Beyond that, you're on your own, he says. So he says it's like Chesterton, like one of Chesterton's nightmares, in fact, without the theological reassurance. Okay, so Chesterton was like kind of a famous Roman Catholic apologist sort of guy. And so that's a big part of, what he's writing. Now, the interesting thing about that is, from Campbell's comment there, which I think he's like totally onto something, is just that that theological reassurance thing. Yes, I do think that's in some ways a little more clearly there in Chesterton than it is in Lafferty. Lafferty's theology is much more precarious. There's a theological precarity to Lafferty's work, not in a sense of his personal, doubt or being devout, but in his presentation of it, is his infusion of it into the world and into his fiction. It's just, wow, it's wildly up for grabs. And you see that in this story, Snuffles, right? So fair enough. But the thing is that it might be missing there is that lack of theological reassurance is kind of there in Chesterton as well in certain respects. And even as he mentions The Man Who Was Thursday, one of probably his most famous novel, and it's very good. Its subtitle is The Man Who Was Thursday, A Nightmare. So it is actually a nightmare in itself. And as it happens, the guys at Alzebo Soup have also done in the past an episode on Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday, which I only found recently looking through their back catalog and listened to it. And it's great. And if you listen to them discuss that, you'll see that it's quite a perplexing novel, especially they found its ending to be, you know, quite a left turn and quite surreal and very difficult to interpret what the novel was about based on that ending and stuff like that. So, you know, there's a you know, a theological precarity in Chesterton's work as well. And this nightmarish quality. So Jorge Luis Borges also was a big fan of Chesterton and was influenced by his work. And he has this super interesting thing to say about Chesterton that I encountered in this collection, Daylight and Nightmare, the Uncollected Stories and Fables of G.K. Chesterton. Marie Smith does an introduction to it in which she quotes Borges saying of Chesterton, something in the makeup of his personality leaned towards the nightmarish, something secret and blind and central. That discord, that precarious subjection of a demoniacal will defines Chesterton's nature. Okay, and that's a quote that in some ways I think could very much apply to Lafferty. So, you know, you can take that away and think about it if you want. But there's this nightmarish thing at the center of Chesterton, he says, and there's a tension there, you know, this demoniacal will that's been put in precarious subjection. And you know, Lafferty's certainly fascinated with demons and devils and these sorts of things, the diabolical. So to say that Snuffles is a Chestertonian planetfall story is to say that it is a planetfall story that is infused with both wonder and nightmare in equal measure and in intention, you know, sort of in this almost undecidable quality between them. Okay, lastly, I just want to say that in terms of planetfall, that Lafferty said in an essay called The Moth-Eaten Magician that the planetfall story was his favorite sort of kind of SF story, kind of science fiction story. So that's when a group of explorers first sets foot on a new world. And Lafferty said the reason for that was that it reminds him of what it's like to wake up every day on planet Earth. That it's just like stepping onto a new world every day, a new planet, because he felt that the ecology and so on was just so prodigious and wonderful and diverse and so on, that it's just like, this is just, we're waking up on a new planet every day. It's so exciting. And I think that is such a cool perspective. And Lafferty does this cool thing where he bounces back and forth between sort of interplanetary tales and tales set in his sort of southwestern bioregion. And if he's out off in the planets, he's often, and we'll see that in several cases here in Snuffles, he's often bringing sort of little elements of his unique to his southwestern bioregion off to the stars. And you see these things in these other planets. But of course, when he's doing his bioregional yarns set there in Oklahoma and Texas and Mexico and a bit in Colorado and Kansas and stuff, he makes this planet strange and fresh. That's that Chestertonian quality. So he really makes good on his idea about planetfall stories reminding him of what it's like to be on Earth. But here we'll see this is set on another planet, which is cool because Chesterton actually did a bit of sort of proto science fiction type stuff, but never anything interplanetary that I'm aware of. So it's cool to see that kind of vibe, but set on another planet. So as to the structure of Snuffles, it is in 3 acts, what you could call 3 acts. It's certainly in 3 parts. They're like, literally in the text from Lafferty, Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3. So it's in these 3 parts. In part 1, it's basically comprised of dialogue and wonder story, is how I would put it. Where there's like these philosophical conversations between the crew members, the sort of astronautical explorers who've been set down on this planet by a sort of a mothership to do their research, punctuated with like descriptions of this very strange planet, right? So dialogue and wonder story, and each section kind of has its own meditation, right? And so in the first section, it seems to be about cosmic horror versus cosmic humor, and we'll see that as we get into it. All right, then in part 2, there's this kind of abrupt moment of horror that triggers this shift into action adventure, okay? And there's like a chase where the characters are being hunted. However, this is where it gets really cool. And for me, it has this like, what I'm calling like a phase shifting quality in these different parts, because it does this this shift over to action adventure. But then they start going through this narcotic belt on the planet, to where basically they literally start to trip. Okay, they're becoming hallucinogenic, and then as they're being chased, they renew some of their conversations, but now under this narcotic influence. And the meditation in this section is really about kind of hallucination and epistemology. Like, is what's happening real? And even if it's not real, does it really matter because we believe it's real? It's a really interesting conversation. And then all that is kind of brought forward into section 3, where the chase is continued, but the conversation continues and is kind of heightened as they go further into the tripping and basically into the mind of Snuffles, or so it seems. And there the meditation becomes about carnival world creation. All right, so that's the rough structure of the whole story. So, part 1, it's about exploring this planet and introducing the titular character, Snuffles. So, there's these two space explorers, Brian and Georgina, and they're discussing what the text calls cosmic intimidation, which is a phrase that the text directs us to, is from Hilaire Belloc, which was a friend of Chesterton. And so, we're being signaled there's Chestertonian things going on here from the beginning. But the cosmic intimidation, just just that feeling, right, of being profoundly minimized by the sheer astronomical scope of the universe, right? Which is, Blaise Pascal famously kind of meditated on this, the sort of horror of it, and people are still thinking about it today. What does that mean for us, that the universe is just so huge? Are we significant at all? And so they're kind of discussing that. And Brian Carroll, he's called Brian Carroll, he says, and did you never hope that out of all the prodigality of worlds, one at least should have been made for fun? One should have been made by a wild child or a mixed up goblin, just to put the rest of them in proper perspective, to deflate the pomposity of the cosmos. So that's the sort of strange setup of this story, is like, what, I don't know why it would matter that there would be an exception to this rule of cosmic horror or cosmic intimidation, but he's like, he's just like, what if there's just one planet made for fun? And I love the language there of that it would have been made by a wild child or a mixed up goblin. And that will, kind of come back to us. But to deflate the pomposity of the cosmos. And he thinks that this planet they're on, which is called Bellota or Bellota, Bellota, and I'll explain why I think it's pronounced Bellota in a bit. He thinks this is that planet. He thinks we've found it. So he says, Bellota was made for fun. It is a joke, a caricature, a burlesque. It is a planet with baggy pants and a putty nose. It is a midget world with floppy shoes and a bull roarer voice. It was designed to keep the cosmos from taking itself too seriously. The law of levity here conspires against the law of gravity. Okay, admittedly problematic language about midget there. It's a product of its time in that way. But the point being, that there's this comical, clownish nature to this planet. And there's this phrase there that actually has been picked up by Lafferty fandom and gets used a lot to describe what Lafferty's doing in general. The law of levity conspires against the law of gravity. And yes, I very much think that that's a lot of what's happening in Lafferty. Now, I think the thing to notice here, and so this is where we begin to think about like how to read Lafferty and what's going on in Lafferty, right? So some of the comments I've heard from Wolf fans, in fact, somebody commented on here, and I'm sorry I don't have your name ready to say who it is, but that there's almost this sense of chaos in Lafferty, or at least in reading Past Master, where they're like, is there something going on here? Is this like chaos? Well, this kind of speaks to that. So what it says here is that the law of levity conspires against the law of gravity. It doesn't say, number one, that the law of levity overcomes the law of gravity or subverts the law of gravity or destroys the law of gravity. It conspires against the law of gravity. And that's totally Laffertian, and that's totally coming out of Tall Tales and his love of con men and all this kind of stuff. But something conspiratorial going on here, and there's this effort to kind of go against gravity. It's not like this settled thing. So you know, that's kind of what you see happening in his fiction, rather than like this pure like, oh, there's no physics, there's no gravity, or there's no, as it were, sort of literary physics holding it together. It's like, well, no, it's just unstable, and there's like there's a trickster element to it. Okay, but furthermore, it's the law of levity, right? This isn't like you know, chaos conspires against gravity or order or something. It's a different kind of order. The law of levity conspires against the kind of order that we're used to, the law of gravity. And so that's what I think you have going on in Lafferty's fiction, is a different order of literature, of writing, of metaphysics and ontology, you know, and so on, kind of conspiring against the conventional world as we know it, both in terms of art and fiction and writing, and in terms of, you know, philosophical things. All right, so worth noting that here as he says this line. And then the narrator pitches in and says that, yes, this planet, Bellota, was a sport, a whole barrel full of puzzles, a place of interest, all out of proportion to its size, eminently worthy of study, and so study it they will, this puzzle planet. So what Lafferty does here, I love, Lafferty is just so unconventional. So, you know, if you've ever been in a creative writing course or anything, you'll know that you're instructed that one of the key principles of good fiction writing, by the way, I forgot to say I've got my Snuffles themed shirt on here today, is to show, don't tell. Particularly about your characters. If they have a quality, if they are shy or gregarious or whatever, don't say they're shy or gregarious. Show them being shy, or show them being really chatty or whatever, right? And Lafferty just turns that around, you know, and people have commented on this, you know, they're like, oh yeah, you're supposed to show, don't tell. Lafferty just doesn't show. I think Terry Bison says something about Lafferty knows the joy is in the telling or something like that. So yeah, so he does a lot of that, and he has this like almost summary quality to characterization and description and all kinds of things, and it does put his fiction much more in the realm of things like myth, fairy tale, folklore, that kind of thing. But it still has a lot of qualities of what we understand as modern fiction at the same time, which is what makes it a little like, what? You know, like, hopefully, to me, in a very enjoyable way. My sense of like being on the back foot with Lafferty is almost always enjoyable. So, but I know that, again, your mileage may vary. But what Lafferty does here, which he does in a number of short stories and some novels, is he lists out his characters. He's got 6 of them. And he numbers, he's like 1, 2, 3. I just love that. I think that's just so fun and silly and strangely works. And here's the cool thing that I noticed. Okay, so in doing my PhD on Lafferty, I really focused on certain themes, eco-critical stuff, monster theory. And it was super exciting, and I continue to do that kind of research on Lafferty. But it doesn't quite allow you to look into craft as much. In a way. I mean, it does on certain levels, but now that I'm like sort of rereading Lafferty, partly for pleasure and partly to do things like this, I'm able to just like take in the story as a whole, and I'm noticing more things about craftsmanship and stuff. And, you know, those of us who like Lafferty know that, you know, he's a great writer. You know, we're just like in awe of his writing, and he inspires writing. If you have aspirations to be a creative writer, you're usually going to feel like writing after reading Lafferty. But don't try to imitate him. That will just frustrate you at how badly you do it compared to how he does it. And many people have tried with varying degrees of success, and nobody completely successfully, in my opinion. But so we know he's a good writer, but we know he's unconventional, okay? But I think I certainly have come to expect him to be so unconventional that I have failed to notice how much he does fulfill a lot of our normal literary expectations, but in an unusual way. So it's really cool to start to see some stuff like that. And for example, with characters, though he like lists them out like this and just says like a few lines about each to sum them up, by and large, they go on to then behave in accordance with how he set them up, which is pretty cool. It's really consistent, and it brings a certain satisfaction to the reading experience. And when you look more closely, and again, this is what I'm saying, it's not just this kind of wild chaos or semi-chaos or whatever. There's like, you know, he puts certain things in place and kind of sticks to them. So he there's this character called John Hardy who he says is commander and commando, and he's like a good-natured conglomerate of clanking iron, and he's described as being a jack of all techniques. He's always in control. He's optimist, and he says he's a blue-eyed, red-headed giant. He handled danger cavalierly, and he liked to laugh a lot, but his laughter wasn't irritating. So that's John Hardy, the commander, right? And then there's this Uncle Billy Cross, or he's Billy Cross, and they call him Uncle Billy. He is the engineer of the group. He's also called a gadgeteer. He's the first mate and navigator, but it also calls him an argufier and a balladeer. And you'll see the argufier kind of part come out. And I think the balladeer just speaks to kind of his poetic soul. But he's a little older than the rest, it says. So that's why they call him Uncle Billy. But it also stipulates of him that he's still a green and growing boy. And this is definitely a little bit of a Lafferty stand-in. The character most like Lafferty in this story, the human character most like Lafferty in this story. And Lafferty's like that. You know, he's this older guy amongst all these young new wave writers all excited about experimenting and stuff. And there's this like 50-year-old guy in their midst, you know, who's like experimenting far more than a lot of them ever will be able to. But also Lafferty is this green and growing boy. He has that, again, this is very Chestertonian, that childhood sort of sense of wonder is very alive in him. Okay, so then there's Dr. Phelan, which they had talked about in their conversation in the beginning of the story. There's this thing called Phelan's corollary in the story that is never explained. It's never outlined or we're told what it is, and I'm not sure how much we're supposed to like chase after that and wonder what it is or not, but he's the author of that. He's called Daniel Phelan, and he's a geologist and a cosmologist, and as a scientist it says of him that he's heretical because of his Phelan's corollary, though we're not told what it is, but it somehow doesn't fit in with accepted science. It says that he's highly professional, but also that he's a rake, a wolf, and a dude. And that's kind of weird. That is not so much followed through on the story in terms of like, he's not like shown to be a womanizer or anything. But he does have there's something a little maybe duplicitous or something about his character. So that does come out. And then there's Margie Cott, who is described as an artist, a photographer, a botanist, a bacteriologist. And I love the way each of these characters is multiple scientists and other things that are not scientists or whatever, in the arts and things like that. And that's very important to Lafferty in general and to this story. In an important sense, this story is about multiplicity and about how you can't reduce things down to some kind of singular or unified thing, that multiplicity will always be there. So it's important that these characters are so multiple in their abilities and interests and that kind of thing. And so it's said of her that she's like chatty and charming, she's good looking and like better looking than anyone has a right to be or something like that. That she is like wanton, it says, and kiddish. It concludes of her salty, really, the newest thing in salinity, which I think is pretty humorous. But yeah, so that's Margie Cott. And then there's Brian Carroll that we've encountered, and it says of him that he's naturalist and natural. It's interesting that he's called the naturalist because other characters are in the natural scientists. I guess he's just more of a general earth sciences sort of guy. But and of course, that's kind of an older term, but older than this story. So anyway, it says of him. Okay, so here is where Brian Carroll is kind of set up to be the emotional core of this story, right? Although that's going to shift a little bit, right? So it says of Brian Carroll, he had been hunting for something all his life, but did not know what it was, and was not sure that he would know it when he found it. But he hoped that it would be different. Oh Lord, he would pray, however it ends, don't let it have a pat ending. That I couldn't stand. He believed that anything repeated was trite, and it was for that reason that there were pleasant surprises for him on Bellota. Now, what's interesting here to me, pardon me, is it occurred to me as I was reading again, there's an interesting little sort of parallel here with a more famous story from Lafferty, 900 Grandmothers, where the main character there, Kieran Swicegood, is obsessed with the question of how did it all begin? So he's all obsessed with origins, and here we have this character obsessed with endings. So that's a cool little diptych there. And both of them find there to be a comic but horrific or troubling element to trying to find the answers to these questions. So really cool to see those two stories set off, and that could probably, we could go on with comparisons of them, but that's very interesting. And then finally it says of Georgina, whom Brian was talking to in the beginning, Georgina Chantal, she's biologist and iceberg. And then it says, but the capsule description may be unjust, for she was more than biologist and much more than iceberg. Frosty only when frostiness was called for. She was always proper and often friendly, but she was no Margie Cott. And in contrast, perhaps she was a little icy. Now, I think there's a little, like, are the women being compared as to who's, friendlier, type of thing? That's kind of lame, if that's what's happening, or if they just, I don't know if they just happen to be the two most extreme characters in the story. But it is interesting to me that there are two professional women on the team, seemingly on equal footing with the men. This is 1960. I have no idea where science fiction is at with that in, say, the 1950s. I mean, I have a little idea. I have a small impression that there's definitely some women scientists that I've seen in fiction from that time and that kind of thing. But on the crew and stuff, I just don't know. But to the degree that that is noteworthy at this time, Lafferty is certainly inclusive of women in his sort of professional teams of people. He frequently is. Though there's more that could be said about that, but it is interesting here. And it concludes with, actually, there wasn't a bad apple in that basket. So with our human characters introduced, it goes on to introduce two more, I think, main characters. And the first one is the planet Bellota. And it's only in these rereads recently that I've been clocking that more and going, oh yeah, the planet here is kind of a character. So it says of the planet, the most obvious peculiarity of Bellota was its gravity, half that of Earth's, though the circumference of the globe was no more than 100 miles. So it's this really small planet, and its gravity is off somehow. And Daniel Phelan believes that it's explained by his Phelan's corollary. And again, it's not outlined here, but here's Phelan's view. Bellota was the only body that behaved as it should. It was the rest of the universe that was atypical. All right, so he thinks this is like what reality should be like, and for some reason everything else is off. And then it goes on, the narrator says, and in other ways, Bellota was a joker. Fruits proved noisome, and thorns succulent. Rinds and shells were edible, and heart meat was not. Proto-butterflies stung like hornets, and lizards secreted honey-like manna, and the water was soda water, sheer carbonated soda water. Okay, so I love this. There's like these ecological reversals and sort of ecological non sequiturs, which you'll keep kind of doing that kind of thing. So you've got, fruits that you eat the outside instead of the inside. Oh, that's unusual. How interesting, And then you've got like, the fruits are noisome too, and that the thorns are succulent. That's really cool. And then like, what are proto-butterflies? I want to see them. That's freaky. But they stung like hornets. Okay, getting a little weirder. And then lizards secreted honey like manna. Like, oh, that's such a left turn. I love that. So, this planet's just a quick snapshot of some ideas of what the flora and fauna are like is very cool. And like, for me, as the kind of reader I am, I'm just like all in at this point. I'm like, cool. And this is why I call it like a wonder story. It's like just this strange approach to these, to understanding these. And let me just say, I have read a fair bit of science fiction, short stories and novels that are set on other planets that do almost nothing, maybe nothing, with flora and fauna, that don't really describe it. And to me, that's an absolute fail in SF, man. I don't want to read SF that doesn't get into the alienness of things, if there's some kind of alien setting, including like flora and fauna, atmosphere, environment, that kind of thing. So this is a real plus for me that Lafferty, even just in his summary way. And I think, when I talk about him being sort of summary and compact and stuff, like a good folklore, folk story or myth or something, I think what he puts in place stays put really well. It's not like this dearth of description that leaves you unsatisfied. It's just a nice little piece of compact description that sticks in your mind and goes, poof, and it's just like, oh, that's really cool, and can kind of sit there as almost a token or a symbol, type of thing. That's the kind of writing I think he does. So it also goes on to say that so since everything's like the lakes and stuff are carbonated water, their only other option for hydration was to catch rainwater. Now, then it says, but the rainwater was, as it says, so highly nitric that drinking it was something of an experience also, for the thunderstorms were excessive. Now, I don't know if he's trying to, emphasize something like nitrous, laughing gas, which would make sense with the story, but certainly some kind of chemical thing is happening if you drink the rainwater, this thunderstorm saturated rainwater, just because to not have carbonated water, you drink that and it's like, whoa, there's something going on there. So keep that in mind. There's chemical things going on almost from the beginning. But Phelan again chips in and says, oh, the thunderstorms here are excessive. He says, it was on all other atmospheric planets known that there was a strange deficiency of thunder showers. And then we're told on Bellota, it rained about 5 minutes out of every 15. And the multicolored lightning was omnipresent, so that they were never without the sound of thunder, near or distant, nor of the probe of lightning. Okay, that's what the story says. And that there was no true darkness there, not even between the flashes. There were flashes between the flashes. Here was meteorology concentrated, without dilution, without filler. Oh, that's just, man, just start to picture this planet. You're drinking this weird rainwater, there's strange flora and fauna, there's constant rumble of thunder and permanent, just constant lightning, multicolored lightning. So, man, this is a strange atmosphere to be in. And I love the thought of doing hard sciences in this kind of trippy atmosphere. That is just cool and interesting. And I really feel strange, interesting resonances there with a writer like, say, Jeff Vandermeer and his Area X trilogy and stuff. Anyway, now here's a good example of how Lafferty brings his bioregion to the stars. Thunder and lightning, storms in general, are a huge part of Oklahoma existence, and indeed that bioregion, which it's called bioregion because it kind of goes out like outside of man-made state lines and stuff. So Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas are all part of the sort of tornado alley, it's called. And it's not just tornadoes, it's all kinds of storms and stuff. And there are huge, big, you can look this up, Google Images and stuff, lightning displays in Oklahoma and stuff. And some of the Native American writers I read that write about Oklahoma and some areas like that, like N. Scott Momaday and stuff, talk about lightning being a big thing. So, yes, we're on an alien world, and I do think it's meant to be alien, but there's also little flavors of Lafferty's bioregion. It's almost a way of tall-tailing his bioregion by putting it on another planet and exaggerating it even more. But he's exaggerating what's already exaggerated about that ecology, so that's kind of cool. And lightning comes up, like bears, that's a big part of this story. But lightning comes up constantly in Lafferty, and sometimes it has agency, and it'll like say a word or something, and that kind of thing. So lightning is a big deal for Lafferty. All right, and well, Georgina makes this little comment. Every lightning flash is entirely different, just as every snowflake is different. And I've always thought of that as being another aspect of this planet that makes it unique. And then recently I was thinking about it, and it's like, no, actually that's true. Or at least if you think of like streaks of lightning, every time there's like this forked lightning that comes down from the sky, which I miss very much from my home place in Indiana. Here in Scotland, you get maybe 2 lightning flashes a year at most, and they're just flashes, just like a psh, and a little rumble of thunder. I miss, I grew up with like terrifying claps of thunder and wild, like demonic displays of lightning crawling down the sky and stuff. Oh, I miss that kind of thing. But yeah, so, and still, and where I came from is nothing like a place like Oklahoma. So, but yeah, so, but it occurred to me that what Georgina says there is like, actually, that's true. Every lightning streak, every lightning strike or whatever is different, like a snowflake. That's kind of an awesome, just a little wonder thought. And it says that there were no seas there, only the soda water lakes that covered a third of the area. And there were flora and fauna that burlesqued more than they really resembled Earth's and kindred worlds. And he says of the trees were neither deciduous nor evergreen nor palm. They were trees as a cartoonist might draw them. And there were animals that made the whole idea of animals ridiculous. So again, this is the environment in which they're doing their scientific research. And it's cartoonish and it's trippy, and I just love it. And one more thing about the planet and this atmosphere in which they're working, this is great, is that there's this diurnal cycle where there's a 28-hour week on Bellota, right? So there's 2 hours of daytime and 2 hours of nighttime in each day. So 4-hour days, 2 and 2, day and night. And again, Phelan insists, well, this is where it's normal. We have sleep problems on other planets because we don't have this cycle. But so it tells us that they explore this planet for 2 weeks, 2 weeks of their time or our time as we understand it, which is 12 Bellota weeks, which is basically a full season, and we'll see how that's important. One more thing about the planet here. It tells us Bellota, this is in the text, Bellota means an acorn. And they had named the planet that from the profusion of edible fruit nuts that looked very like the acorn. These were a delicacy that became a staple. Keep that phrase in mind. We'll come back to it. As I'm getting to this part, I'm remembering something I wanted to say from the beginning, which is still applicable at this point, if you're this far in it. And that is, if you care about spoilers and you want to read this story, please stop the video and go read it. It's online. Just look up the story. The Internet Archive has the original Galaxy printing of it. It's good, easy read. I mean, like, it's really legible. And you should read it because by and large, first of all, on this channel, I'm not bothered with spoilers. And I should probably say that every episode or something. But by and large, I don't think Lafferty's fiction is all that spoilery. You know, like it's not that kind of plot and stuff that you can spoil very much. But Snuffles is a shining exception. This is at a certain point becomes like a suspense story. And so just stop. Now, if you're going on, I want to say that this isn't giving much away, but there is like this, you feel this inevitability as to what's going to happen. And even once something happens, there's still a further question of what's going to happen, and you feel an inevitability about that. But in both cases, you're just not sure, and you need to find out, you know, and you're kind of like, oh, and it kind of keeps you going until the end of like, well, how's this going to turn out? I think I know how it's going to turn out, but I don't know for sure. So it's pretty cool to see. That's not really what I go to Lafferty for, you know, kind of suspense or something like that. But it's cool to have him do that in a story like this. So Bellota means acorn. Okay, and when I looked this up, I realized this is apparently mainly from Mexican. It's a Spanish word, and it's mainly from Mexican Spanish, and it describes the acorn of a particular scrub oak, a species that's particular to the southwestern U.S. Lafferty's region. If you look it up on Wikipedia, I can't say this Latin name, but like Quercus gambili. But it shows its sort of distribution, and it's mainly Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, and a little bit into Texas, tiny bit into the panhandle of Oklahoma. And that's what, that panhandle gets Oklahoma involved in a lot of more what we think of as more proper southwestern type stuff. But so that's what's being referenced here through this linguistic, note here of calling it Bellota. Now, what I think of when I hear him call this planet an acorn, or give it the name of an acorn, is there's this line in Julian of Norwich, her Revelations of Divine Love. This is an awesome piece of vision literature. I had to read it for a medieval vision literature class that I did as an undergrad that I didn't want to do because I didn't want to do any, you had to take a pre-1600 course or something, and I had avoided it, and I didn't realize it was a requirement, and I just kind of picked what was left, and I will never regret it. It was one of the best classes I ever took. We did like Pearl and, we did some of Canterbury Tales, which I wasn't as impressed with. I know that's a big deal, but anyway, like these, Piers Plowman, that was amazing. And this book, interestingly enough, in here, amongst her many visions, she has this one where she says this: "He showed me a little thing the size of a hazelnut in the palm of my hand, and it was as round as a ball. I looked at it with my mind's eye, and I thought, what can this be? And the answer came, it is all that is made." And that just really works for me. That like miniature, gigantic, reversal, cosmic, type thing, but like bringing the cosmos down to the size of a little nut, or the nut blowing up to the size of the cosmos. I'm trying to get used to saying cosmos. I don't know where I picked up cosmos over the years. I think some Brits say it that way. Anyway, so that's what kind of comes to my mind. Now, Lafferty drew on some of these types of writers, very famously Teresa of Avila in Fourth Mansions, Lafferty's novel Fourth Mansions. But that I know of, he never directly references Julian of Norwich. And I don't know if he has that kind of thing in mind, but I think it's, worth keeping in mind. And, this is about a made planet, that's being compared to an acorn. Now, what's much more likely on Lafferty's mind, or at least in the background somewhere, is the Aristotelian Thomistic associations involved in the acorn, because that was one of the main examples that both Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas used to talk about teleology, that things have a telos, which is Greek for an end or a goal, right? And Aristotle was into like these different kinds of causes, 4 different kinds of causes, whereas we think of like what he called, well, at least probably what he called efficient cause, where this thing happens and it makes another thing happen. He had all kinds of other ideas about material cause and formal cause and efficient cause, and then this final cause, what he calls final cause, and that's teleology. It's like, what is the thing aiming toward? What is it made for? What's it going? And the acorn, its final cause is to become an oak tree. Okay, so I can't help but think that that's a little bit involved here with this acorn planet, Bellota. And we'll see some more things about, or at least one more thing about the possible linguistic implications here of Bellota. But yeah, so this acorn association then makes me think back to Brian when it said of him that he prays, "Oh Lord, don't let it, however it ends, don't let it have a pat ending." And you could almost say he's saying, don't let it have a pat teleology, right? Don't let it have a pat telos, which I think is just fascinating. Okay, so we get to, in this first section of the story, an introduction of the titular character, and I love the way it introduces, and there was Snuffles. That's how, that's how he comes in. And there was Snuffles. Now we've gotten to the main point, as it were. And then it begins to describe Snuffles, and then goes on this huge tangent that is really describing Snuffles in a circuitous way. Okay, but anyway, it says, Snuffles was a bear, possibly, and of sorts. The bear is himself a caricature of animal kind, somehow a giant dog, somehow a shaggy man, an ogre, and also a toy. And Snuffles was a caricature of a bear. All right, so, that's one of my favorite lines from Lafferty. He has these like almost like little proverbs or wisdom sayings, just about life, wit and wisdom. You could collect like the wit and wisdom of R.A. Lafferty. I've seen that kind of thing with like Chesterton and stuff. You could collect these little sayings, just that like isolated saying. The bear is himself a caricature of animal kind, somehow a giant dog, somehow a shaggy man, an ogre, and also a toy. And he's right, culturally speaking, that the bear has been seen in all these ways and has these kind of, even just to look at it, has these kind of qualities. But I love how he sets up what Snuffles is by talking about how strange of an animal the bear is, and how the bear is an animal, a caricature of other animals. And then he says Snuffles was a caricature of a bear. So Snuffles is a caricature of a caricature. So he's weird like the rest of this planet, okay? So, and keep in mind, he's only sort of a bear. In the illustration in Galaxy, he's just kind of drawn as a giant bear, which is fun. And he is giant like that. But, I think, I haven't been able to find any art online, and I generated some AI art that's in my slides. Maybe I'll try to, I don't know if I can include them or not, but, just to get a little more sense of how weird this being is, well, as we'll see, it calls him a pseudo-ursine. But anyway, so it talks about him being a caricature of a bear. And then Billy Cross, our argue-fire of the group, right? It says of him, he was an old bear man, and he tried to explain to them about bears. And as I said, I think Lafferty is an old bear man. He's into bears, and they come up so much in his fiction in cool ways. Anyway, here's what Billy says. The bear is the only animal that children dream of without having seen or been told about. Children universally dream of bears. Tahitian children subject to no ursine influence in themselves or their ancestry. Australian children, town tykes before they ever saw a bear toy. They dream of bears. The bear is the booger man. Bears live in the attics of old childhood houses. They did in my own and in thousands of others. Their existence there is not of adult suggestion, but of innate childhood knowledge. Just what a weird thing to say. And I haven't researched this. I have no idea if there's anything in sort of anthropological literature or something about children dreaming of bears. I don't. And you never know with Lafferty. You can either think it's fun or frustrating. I mostly think it's fun. But you can go to look up these like historical claims and other types of things that Lafferty will say. And it's, I guess, I don't know, I want to say it's about 50-50. That like it's just something he made up for fun. And sometimes it's this like little piece of erudite, esoteric, or arcane knowledge that he happens to know about. And you look at it, oh yeah, that's a fact. Like, that's so cool. But anyway, but it's just so cool to like associate bears with like this like haunting type character, this dream character and associated with the boogeyman, or as he says, the booger man here. So there's like a very, obvious, this is moving into like monster territory, and it's a monster, very useful for like thinking about it in terms of monster theory and stuff like that. And here's a point about that. So Billy goes on to say, but there is a duality about this booger man. He is friendly and fascinating as well as frightening. The booger man is not a story that adults tell to children. It is the only story that children tell to adults who have forgotten it. So that friendly but fascinating duality about the boogeyman, that's what monster theorists have identified in monsters more generally. That there's what one theorist, Timothy Beale, calls the monstrous sublime. But there's this, using that Latin phrase, what is it? Mysterium tremendum et fascinans. The mystery that like terrifies us, makes us tremble, but also fascinates us. So there's an attraction, repulsion quality to the monster. And Lafferty brings that out here about bears, and then by association about Snuffles. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to say about that was that here's a good example of Lafferty bringing in the so-called soft sciences, right? That are going to become very prominent in a short time in the new wave of science fiction. This is 1960. So I'm not saying he precipitated that. I highly doubt he did, because his influence was probably pretty minimal at this point. And there's probably other examples of this happening in the 50s leading up to the new wave. But he's certainly an early practitioner of it. He's anticipating what's coming in his fiction. And, so there's like an emphasis on anthropology and psychology, comparative myth, comparative religion, that we'll see come up in spades, and people like, Delaney and Zelazny, they love doing that kind of stuff. And of course, Le Guin's anthropological science fiction and stuff like that. Yeah, so he's anticipating that here. Now, Billy is not done with what he has to say about bears and his theories. You get a lot of theory chat in Lafferty. For me, it's a blast. And I don't, even if that's not your thing, it's in a story like this, sometimes you really notice it. Other times you don't notice it a whole lot. It just, Lafferty's a good writer. He keeps, at his best, keeps things moving along and stuff. But even when there's a lot of it and it's noticeable to me, I really enjoy it, because I like, if it's of interest to me, I really like philosophical chat in fiction. If you're a reader of something like Borges or something, you should be up for this. And I find the way that the characters outline their theories and stuff to be anything but dry. I mean, they're just so full of life and color, just in their sheer ideas and stuff. So anyway, Billy Cross goes on to say that the booger man, as he calls him, is philologically interesting. That's how he puts it. Here's what he says. So there's these italicized words from other languages that I will not be able to pronounce, right? But he says, though bog has come to mean God in the Slavic, yet the booger was earlier an animal man demiurge, and the Sanskrit baga is not without this meaning. In the sense of a breaker, a smasher, it is in the Old Irish as bong, and the early Lithuanian as banga. In the sense of a devourer, it survives in the Greek root fag, and as one who puts to flight, it is in the Latin fug. We have, of course, the Welsh bug, BWG. Who knows how to pronounce Welsh? I should just go look it up. We have, of course, the Welsh BWG, a ghost, and bogey has been used in the meaning of the devil. And we have bugbear, which rounds out the circuit. So he goes on this like etymological spree, bringing in all these associations of what a bear kind of symbolizes or signifies, right? And Georgina responds to this and says, so you make God and the bear and the devil one. And that's appropriate to this story, as we'll see. And John Hardy makes a comment that in many mythologies, it was the bear who made the world. And I love his little aside from that. He says, after that, he did nothing distinguished. It was felt by his devotees that he'd done enough. It's just funny. But yeah, so I'll come back to, I'll list these out in a second here. All these associations being brought to bear on the bear, I didn't think of that pun, and then through association further on Snuffles, right? Now, this reminds me, when we're talking about this as cosmic horror, appropriate to mention a possible Lovecraftian connection. Graham Harman, in his book, Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy, talks about Lovecraft in relation to Graham Harman's philosophical project, this school of philosophy called Object-Oriented Ontology, often abbreviated as OOO. Some people pronounce it OO. But yeah, so, and that's something I study a lot for my research, and I find it very fascinating. It's controversial, but I like it. It's interesting. I have no allegiance to it, but I think it's useful and fascinating. Anyway, so he thinks that Lovecraft is kind of the poet of OOO. He brings out what object-oriented ontology is all about. So Harman outlines these two main modes that he suggests Lovecraft has for describing his monsters, his monstrous entities, monstrous cities, and all that kind of stuff. And he calls them, respectively, the elusive and the cubist approach to describing monsters in Lovecraft. Now, here's what he says. The elusive aspect of Lovecraft's style is seen in the gap he produces between an ungraspable thing and the vaguely relevant descriptions that the narrator is able to attempt. All right, and Cthulhu would be an example of this. Harman mentions that, some people have told him, like, I don't find Cthulhu scary. I mean, like a dragon with an octopus head or whatever, that's not scary. And Harman's response is that, well, you didn't read the story carefully enough. It never says that's what Cthulhu looks like. It says all these removes of language to say that, like, in my fevered imagination, there's a phrase like it would not be untrue to the spirit of the thing to say, and so there's like, this elusive approach that's like, yeah, it makes me think of all these different things, but it's not necessarily any of those or just some kind of like composite creature made up of those. It has these qualities, and you miss that in all these drawings of Cthulhu and stuff, which I love. I got my little Cthulhu, my knit Cthulhu here. He's got wings. Can't really tell. Oh, they're worse for wear. But yeah, say hi, Cthulhu. Yeah, and I love that art of Cthulhu in that way. It's fun, but that's not what that story's about, and that's not really what Lovecraft is trying to describe. And so that's his elusive approach, and Harman calls him rather than a reductionist, he calls him a productionist, in that he produces these gaps between, as he says, the ungraspable thing, that thing you just can't describe, this monstrous entity, and our language that tries to give some clue, right? And that's what Lafferty's doing here to a certain extent, particularly with this whole, like, he was a bear, but he wasn't a bear. He was like a bear, sort of, a pseudo-ursine, so you get the elusive quality in that. And then there's this cubist approach that Harman outlines where he says that language is overloaded by a gluttonous excess of surfaces and aspects of the thing that the narrator is trying to describe in some Lovecraft story, right? And Lovecraft is infamous for purple prose, and it both works and doesn't work. Like, a lot of it is really bad writing, in my opinion. But it's so over the top that it works in its way. For me anyway, especially when he's describing like monsters and stuff. And you could think of like, well, the example that Harman points out there is the Whatley brothers in the Dunwich Horror, which is one of my favorite, maybe my favorite Lovecraft story. But the way they're described, both the first guy, and then later the big brother, or is he a little brother? But he's big. You know, just like this huge agglomeration of stuff. So there's that glut, you know, of language to try to describe it, and that's what he calls the cubist approach, where you just put all these surfaces together and try to make it work, like this excessive way. And in a way, Lafferty's doing that in an etymological mode here, instead of like a bunch of physical descriptions, and we'll get a little more of that, but it's like just all these ideas piled onto each other in describing what a bear is, and then by association what Snuffles is. So if we take all these things together, and a few more we're going to see as the story unfolds, right? Here's what Snuffles is. He's a caricature of a caricature. He's a dog, man, ogre, toy, the boogeyman, a childhood dream creature, haunter of attics, god, demiurge, breaker, smasher, devourer, chaser, ghost, devil, locomotive, clown, and carnival king. And then some of those are what we'll see in a bit. So, yeah, you know, and here's the cool thing. This is another like craft type thing. Every single one of those little aspects is going to come out in the story and be part of what makes up Snuffles. So after this big long aside on bears, which for me, I mean, the story's worth the price alone just for this chat on bears. It's just cool. But anyway, it goes back to that elusive approach and says, Snuffles was not a bear exactly. He was a pseudo-ursine, right? So just that reminder there, right? He was big and clumsy and bounced around on 4 legs and then up on 2. He was friendly, chillingly so, for he was huge, and he snuffled like some old track-eating train, okay? And this hugeness, I thought about it once. Later it'll say that he has foot-long like teeth. So if you think of what a bear's teeth look, I've never tried to like do this mathematically, but you know, a bear's teeth, however big a bear fang is, and extend it to a foot long and then make the rest of the bear that size. I mean, we're talking, I don't know. I think, you know, the biggest bears, stand up to like 10 feet, maybe more, 14, I don't know. But this is like 20 feet tall or something. This, you know what it makes me think of course, if you've read it. Spoiler for Dan Simmons' The Terror. Close your ears. But that giant polar bear spirit creature thing is maybe about the size of Snuffles. So imagine, and that's what I love that Lafferty does. Instead of this ethereal or horrible thing, like it's like he's friendly, and that it says chillingly so. So it's like, you know, the friendliness and some of the comical qualities here just make it more unsettling, which is a cool take on horror and cosmic horror. So it also says of Snuffles, he was a clown, but he seemed to observe the line that the visitors drew. He did not come really close, though often too close for comfort. He obeyed, or when he did not wish to obey, he pretended to misunderstand. He was the largest animal on Bellota, and there seemed to be only one of him. So yeah, I just love this like clownishness and this like mischievousness about him. Like he just pretends to not understand. And I mean, if you have a pet, you know what that's like. Talking about you, August. My dog is called August. Someday I'll put him on camera. I think it's because he can't quite jump on my lap where I'm sitting, that you never see him. So the fact that there's only one of them makes them observe that he doesn't appear to have any sex at all. He's, you know, no genitals that they can see, which brings on this little aside on how teddy bears in other cultures and times have had genitals. And I haven't looked that up, and I don't know if we're meant to like think more about that in the story or not, but it's a funny little aside there. Anyway, it says also that Snuffles is a mimic, right? And it says that he pretends to read their books, that he has these claws that can like well, I love this phrasing here, that the claws are retractable and, quote, his digits projective. Claws retractable, digits projective. But yeah, so he could like retract his claws and then like kind of extend his paws into fingers. So it said that he basically had hands when he wanted them, so he could pretend to turn these pages and read, or turn the pages and pretend to read, and he could handle sort of bottle caps and can openers and things like that. And eventually he's really helpful, and he fetches them water and wood, and he boils the water for them apparently, and he bites the wood down to the size they need, and it says that he bundles them with lianas, which I think is a cool little touch. And then it says, and he gathered bellotas by the bushel. Remember, it's a delicacy that becomes a staple. Now, interestingly, when I was looking up this word, as it turns out, there are some pigs in South America, apparently, that are fed on an exclusive diet of bellotas that apparently produces a high-quality ham. So make of that what you will with these characters in Snuffles. And it says that Snuffles could talk. And then it qualifies this by saying that he makes vocables that widely varied in tone and timbre, and that they consisted of like snokel, 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 snook, snook, and snoof. And these indicated various moods in Snuffles. And there's this moment where John Hardy, the commando guy, he creates their supply dump and weapons center, and he really firmly makes a boundary line and tells Snuffles no uncertain terms that he's not allowed to cross that line. And Snuffles goes off in a huff and piles up some random rocks and makes a line around them and makes sure that nobody's allowed to cross over there. And it says that he forbade access with roars and foot-long fangs. That's where I get that size thing from. But yeah, so that's a funny thing about what Snuffles does there. And so to round out this first portion of the story, it says that the crew got on with the business of studying the planet. And it says that their aim was to study the life of the planetoid, to classify, to take samples, tests, notes, and pictures, to hypothesize and build a basis for theory. Okay, now I want to point out here that both with Lafferty and all the new wave writers coming up, or I think most of them, most of the major ones, this emphasis on soft sciences over hard sciences that happens for a while, and then the hard science fiction returns eventually, is not a competition thing. It's just a shift. And all these writers, including Lafferty, highly valued the so-called hard sciences and their findings and that kind of work. But they, first of all, just wanted to look into other kinds of stuff that can still be related to sciences broadly understood. And I do think they're also critiquing, some of the alleged lab coat objectivity of the scientist, that, we're all cultural, psychological creatures, and that's going to determine what we count as scientific evidence, or what we choose to study, or how we theorize it and understand it. So I do think Lafferty is serious about these guys doing their scientific work, but he is also serious about putting it into like a trippy context to make it trickier and remind us of how weird even just doing science is in its way. Okay, and it says of the planet that a feature there was the rapidity of enzyme and bacterial action. A good wine could be produced in 4 hours, and a fungus cheese made from grub exudations in even less time. And in the new atmosphere, thoughts also seemed to ferment rapidly. So, if they're eating this cheese and wine, drinking this nitric rainwater, things are already tingling in their brains on this planet, this strange planet. And here, John Hardy, again, that commando guy, has this little conversation about his theory of death and that we only die because we make a crucial mistake and things like that. And in response to this, Daniel Phelan says, poppycock. And Uncle Billy unloads again etymologically on this. He's like, I wonder if you know the true meaning of poppycock. Here's August chipping in. Tell him, August. Okay. Shh. Come here and say hello. Here he is. Here's the boy. He's a goofy boy. Say hi, August. Hello. Mwah. All right. Yeah, this theory about death, to which Daniel Phelan says, poppycock. And Uncle Billy says, I wonder if you know the true meaning of poppycock. And he says, it is poppy talk, opium talk, rambling of one under the narcotic. Now, the element cock in the word is not, as you would imagine, from either the Norwegian cock, a dung heap, nor from cockard in the sense that Rabelais uses it, but rather from, and then Phelan interrupts and says, poppycock, again. And it says that Phelan disliked Billy Cross's practice of analyzing all words, and he denied his assertion that a man who uses a word without feeling its full value is a dealer in false coinage, in fact, a liar. So I think, there's definitely some of Lafferty coming out. I mean, he loves words and he understands words. He read, 6 or 8 other languages than English. So he just loves words. And I do think there's some of his love of words and his frustration at people maybe not appreciating words coming through there. But it's all mixed up because, he was also into the liar's aesthetic, of tall tales and stuff. So, there's complications there, but that's cluing us in that there's something about this story that it is opium talk. That's important to this story. And I can't help but wonder if that's like an idea of how to understand all of Lafferty's fiction, that it is poppycock in that liar's aesthetic, in the tall tales sense. There's more to be said about Lafferty and drugs and alcohol and all that kind of thing and how that influences things. It's complicated, but regardless, there's a sense in which you could call Lafferty's fiction poppycock. But like tall tales, like the liar's aesthetic, it's something, it's not that it means it's just pure lies and it tells no truth, it's that it tells truth through lies, that kind of thing. Now, there's this important little shift here when they're talking about death, that they shift into talking about animals, and Margie Cott suggests that there may, as she says, may be no clear line between animal and man. And Daniel responds to that, Daniel Phelan, and this sounds very like his character. He says, an animal is paradoxically a creature without an anima, without a soul. This comes oddly from me because I also deny it to man in its usual connotation. But there is a total difference, a line that the animal cannot cross and did not cross. When we arrive at wherever we are going, he will still be skulking in his den. And then Brian points out, well, here Snuffles sleeps in the open, and it is we who den, because they'd each made these little sort of caves like the supply dump where they're doing their research, and Snuffles sleeps out in the open. But yeah, this is, you know, more of a under theme in this story to some degree. What am I trying to, subtext? I don't know, but it becomes explicit in a lot of Lafferty stories, and Animal Fair is the most explicit one to me. And Lafferty would not deny anima to souls, nor would the Thomistic Catholic theological tradition that he's in, or at least as some people understand it. And I don't think he would say, I don't think he would have a problem saying there's some differences between different kinds of animals, including non-humans and other animals, but that there's not this like just pure line that can't be crossed. In fact, he puts us in kinship with non-human animals, like quite blatantly, like in that story Animal Fair, we're all part of a household, it says. And that's, you know, directly related to ecology. Oikos is the Greek word being drawn on there for ecology, which is house or household, you know, and that's, you know, the planet viewed as a shared, you know, domicile for all of us. So yeah, so that's, you know, that's going on in here. And there's, you know, I think, you know, he wants to set up a little bit like whose point of view to kind of problematize and who's to sympathize with and that kind of thing. And it notes that John Hardy made a fetish of security. And Hardy notices this strange thing about Snuffles on top of everything else, is that while it's raining frequently there, every 5 minutes out of 15, Snuffles never gets wet. So just adding to the mystery of what in the world Snuffles is. And then truly lastly on this part, and for this video, you get this last bit of sort of theory in this first section of the story. We're just kind of getting used to the planet and the characters and Snuffles and what's going on here. Brian's happy. Brian Carroll, who's looking for that thing, he says, the joy of this place is that it is not Pat. And here's what he says. We could be here for years and never see the end of the variety. With the insects, there may be as many species as there are individuals. Each one could almost be regarded as a sport, as if there were no standard to go by. The gravity here is cockeyed. Please don't analyze the word, Billy. So funny. I doubt myself that it means rooster-eyed. The chemistry gives one a hopeful feeling. It uses the same building blocks as the chemistry elsewhere, but it is as if each of those blocks were just a little off. The lightning is excessive, as though whoever was using it had not yet tired of the novelty. I never tired of the novelty of lightning myself. And when this place ends, it will not have a pat ending. Other globes may turn to lava or cold cinders. Bellota will pop like a soap bubble, or sag like spaghetti, or turn into an exploding world of grasshoppers. But it won't conform. I love Bellota, and I do hate a pat ending. So a lot going on there. And this, in part, I think speaks to what it's like to read Lafferty, okay? So there's this sense in which when you're reading through Lafferty, and maybe at the novel length even more so, that you might get this idea, you might be like, wait a minute, is there any standard to go by here? You know, it's just every sort of narrative turn, just a novelty, and it's all individuals and no species, you know, so to speak. But notice how he says that there are building blocks. There's building blocks of chemistry here, just like anywhere else, but the blocks are a little off. And I would say that there's building blocks of narrative and story and literary, you know, tropes and modes and all that kind of thing in Lafferty, but they're off, you know, they're different, and you're gonna have to like get used to them. And there still will be an excess involved. There's always an excessiveness and exuberance in Lafferty that will make the story careen, you know, make it real. And I love it. You know, you love it or you don't, but I just want to say that, you know, it's not all about the pure anarchic chaos of wild narrative. There's always something going on. And I remember when I was first reading Lafferty saying, and me and a few other people reading were like, it's like with every story, and sometimes within the story, we were like, it's almost like anything can happen, right? And it so happens that one of my kids recently read their very first Lafferty story, pretty randomly picked up something I had, and they read Fog in His Throat, which is a pretty obscure story. Another one that Ramsey Campbell collected, really strange little story. And they liked it, and they said, but they did say, like, they said almost that exact wording of like, it was almost like anything could happen, you know. And then we talked more about some of the themes and you know, the planks, the building blocks that are in place there, even though it is also in a certain sense so open that there's like a freedom there. But there's still order in Lafferty, even though it's a different order, as I've said, and it's a very open order that can do a lot. It doesn't do just anything and everything, but it does a lot, okay? And so the planet Bellota is, in a nutshell, what it's like to read Lafferty. And this, that the lightning is excessive, as though whoever was using it had not yet tired of the novelty. I mean, that's almost straight out of Chesterton. There's somewhere where Chesterton says that about sunrises. Like that, it's like there's this like cosmic child saying every day, again, 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 because they're just like not tired of seeing the sunrise. They think it's so cool, you know? And, you know, you get that with the lightning here. And then this wonderful thing he says about other globes may turn to lava or cold cinders. Bellota will pop like a soap bubble. That's cool enough, you know? Instead of heat death, pop like a soap bubble. Okay, weird. Or sag like spaghetti. So bizarre. And then, or turn into an exploding world of grasshoppers, which is something my mind pictures every time and then unpictures, because it's like, what is that, you know? But yeah, and that sense, again, that Lafferty does where he kind of does the inverted or the unusual and then kind of goes really left field from there into like the completely unexpected, you know? But again, it speaks to that, you know, no Pat ending, no Pat Teleology. I just want to say that, like Brian, I love Bellota. I mean, you know, as we'll see, it's a dangerous place, but it's so cool. Great little invention within science fiction and speculative fiction. And then, man, I mean, if you've read the story, you know what it's like to read it. And this all, you know, quite hangs together. But Lafferty can pile in a lot in a short space, a lot of theoretical material in a short space. And maybe that's part of what makes it seem a little like, what's going on here? But, and again, like in somebody like Gene Wolfe or I would say like Cormac McCarthy and stuff, that, you know, it means that this repays rereading. There's just so much going on. There's so many layers and pieces that you can really dig in. So lastly in this section, one more theoretical thing is put in place. Georgina says, she's thinking about the old precept of know thyself, or its variant, as she says, look within. So she's thinking about know thyself, look within. And it says, or she says, look within. But our eyes point outward. The only way we can see our faces is in a mirror or in a picture. Each of us has his mirror, and mine is more often the microscope. But we cannot see ourselves but we cannot see ourselves as we are until we see ourselves distorted. That is why Snuffles is also a mirror for all of us here. We can't understand why we're serious until we know why he's funny. Now, that is a core of this story, and it's the central puzzle or mystery, and I don't think I've figured it out yet. Like, if I could name why Snuffles is funny, then I'm supposed to be able to understand why, you know, humanity is serious or something. And I'm not sure I've reached it yet, but it's so enticing. Anyway, But there's this whole thing about like studies, for example, studying things scientifically shows us something about our internal selves, about our psychology even. And I happen to be reading a Jung essay. I'm finally, instead of just reading people say stuff about Jung, I'm trying to read some actual Jung. There's an essay called The Stages of Life. And in it he says, "For it is out of himself and out of his peculiar constitution that man has produced his sciences. They are symptoms of his psyche." That's what Jung says about the sciences. And I think that has become more standard understanding, though not enough. I think we still think of scientists and the sciences as like this big objective thing, and maybe the main avenue of truth. But there's a subjective level to the sciences in that subjective people came up with them. But I'm not saying there's nothing objective about them, nor is Jung, nor is Lafferty, by any means. It's a lot of exciting stuff that we can find out about the world through the sciences, but it's just more complicated than that. And so Lafferty's just bringing that up here and pointing out how the world is a mirror of our inner selves. And that's an important thing about Lafferty with understanding who we are, that there's always going to be this inner outer thing, that to look within we need to look without, and vice versa. But yeah, there's always this like correspondence and sort of interdependence between inner and outer ecologies, inner and outer cosmologies, and this story is in part about that. So that's part one. Part two is short and action-packed, so we'll be able to get through that pretty quick in the next episode and go on to, again, a complicated part in part three and say some concluding remarks about the story. But thanks for tuning in. I know this was a long episode, but I think it's better to do it that way than break it up into a whole bunch of short videos. And as I said, this is kind of moving into some, not always, we'll still do some short videos, but some long play Lafferty format for those like me who would like to hear a long discussion about it. And I will still try at some point to get co-hosts on here to help me discuss this stuff, so it's not just one guy talking for an hour and a half or something. But for now, that's the way it is, and I really look forward to hearing what you're getting from this story in the beat by beat sort of analysis. So we'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.